The cellar door slammed shut above Maeve Nolan's head, and she heard the bolt slide into place with a finality that made her bones ache with cold fear. She pressed her palms against the rough wooden planks, her breath coming in shallow gasps as darkness swallowed her whole. This was the third time this week that Mrs. Hartwell had locked her down here, and each time felt like dying a little more. The excuse was always the same. Maeve had been lazy, careless, disrespectful, but the truth was simpler and crueler. Mrs. Hartwell enjoyed watching people suffer, and Maeve, an orphaned Irish girl with nowhere else to go, made an easy target. The year was 1873, and Portland, Oregon had grown from a rough frontier town into something resembling civilization, but that polish only ran surface deep. Behind closed doors, cruelty still flourished like mold in damp places. The Hartwell mansion sat on the edge of town where the streets gave way to wilderness, a 3-story monument to timber money and social ambition. To the outside world, the Hartwells were respectable people. Inside their walls, Maeve lived in a kind of quiet hell. She sank down onto the dirt floor, pulling her thin cotton dress around her knees. The cellar smelled of earth and rot, and something skittered in the darkness near the preserve shelf. Rats, probably. She had learned not to scream at them anymore. Screaming only made Mrs. Hartwell leave her down here longer. Maeve was 19 years old, and she could barely remember a time when she had not been afraid. Her parents had died of fever when she was 12, and she had been passed from household to household ever since, always the charity case, always the one who should be grateful for any scrap of kindness. The Hartwells had hired her 2 years ago, and at first she had thought herself lucky. They paid her $3 a month and gave her a room in the attic. It was more than some girls got, but Mr. Hartwell had wandering hands, and when Maeve had rejected his advances, Mrs. Hartwell had decided she was a troublemaker. The cellar punishments had started then. Sometimes for a few hours, sometimes overnight. Once, they had left her for 2 full days with nothing but a jar of water and some stale bread. Above her head, she could hear the muffled sounds of the household going about its evening routines. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Dishes clattered. Someone laughed. The normal sounds of people living their lives while she sat in the dark, forgotten. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried not to cry. Crying did not help. Nothing helped. She had thought about running away 100 times, but where would she go? She had no family, no money, no prospects. In Portland, a girl alone was prey for worse things than the Hartwells. At least here she had a roof over her head most of the time, even if that roof was currently 8 feet above her and locked tight. The hours crawled past. Maeve dozed fitfully, her head resting against the cold stone foundation. She dreamed of sunlight, of open spaces, of a life where no one could lock her away. She woke to the sound of shouting. At first, she thought she was still dreaming, but the voices were too clear, too urgent. Heavy boots thundered across the floor above. Mrs. Hartwell was shrieking something about property rights and the law. A man's voice rumbled in response, too low for Maeve to make out the words, but there was something in that voice that made her sit up straight. It was not Mr. Hartwell. It was someone else entirely, more shouting. A crash, then footsteps coming toward the cellar door. "She is not down there," Mrs. Hartwell was saying, her voice pitched high with panic. "There is nothing down there but preserves and winter storage. You have no right to search my home." "I got a right to look anywhere I damn well please when there is talk of a girl being locked up like an animal." That voice again, rough as gravel and absolutely unyielding. "Now move aside, or I will move you aside." Maeve scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. She did not know what was happening, but something inside her sparked to life for the first time in months. Hope, maybe, or just the desperate belief that anything was better than this. The bolts scraped back. The door swung open. Light poured down the stairs, and Maeve threw up her hands to shield her eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness. A shape filled the doorway, backlit by the kitchen lamps. As Maeve's eyes adjusted, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was the biggest man she had ever seen in her life. He had to duck his head to fit through the doorway, and his shoulders nearly brushed both sides of the frame. He wore buckskin and wool, the practical clothes of someone who lived outside civilization's boundaries. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, the face of a man who had spent years in the mountains and the wild. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were a startling pale blue like ice in sunlight, and when they fixed on her huddled form at the bottom of the stairs, something in them blazed with anger. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. Then louder over his shoulder, "She is down here. Looks half-starved and scared out of her wits." He came down the stairs, and each step made the wooden boards creak under his weight. Maeve pressed herself back against the wall, not sure whether to be more frightened or relieved. He was a stranger. She had no idea what he wanted or why he was here, but he had opened the door. He had let in the light. He stopped a few feet away from her, crouching down so he was closer to her eye level. Up close, she could see the details. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the rough stubble on his jaw, the way his hands were calloused and scarred from hard work. He was probably 30 or so, she guessed, old enough to have lived a lot of life, young enough to still be in his prime. "My name is Callum Quinn," he said, and his voice was gentler now, though no less rough. "I am not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name, Maeve?" she whispered. Her voice came out thin and raspy. "Maeve Nolan. Maeve." He said it carefully, like he was testing the shape of it. "How long have they had you down here? Since yesterday morning." She swallowed hard. "But they do it a lot, whenever Mrs. Hartwell gets angry or when I do not." "When Mr. Hartwell tries to." She could not finish the sentence. Shame burned in her throat. Callum's jaw tightened. The muscle jumped under his skin. "I understand," he said. "You do not have to explain. Can you walk?" "I think so." "Then come on, we are leaving." He held out his hand. Maeve stared at it, at the calluses and old scars, at the steady strength in those thick fingers. She had no idea who this man was or why he had come for her, but every instinct she had was screaming at her to take that hand and not let go. She reached out and placed her small, dirty hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. He pulled her gently to her feet, and when her legs wobbled from hours of sitting in the cold, he slipped an arm around her waist to steady her. "I have got you," he said. "Just hold on to me." They climbed the stairs together. Maeve's heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. As they emerged into the kitchen, she saw Mrs. Hartwell standing by the stove, her face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. Mr. Hartwell was there too, looking pale and angry, a purple bruise blooming on his left cheek. "You cannot just take her," Mrs. Hartwell spat. "She is under contract. She owes us 2 more years of service to repay her room and board. This is theft." Callum's expression did not change, but something in the air around him went very cold and very dangerous. "Your contract is not worth the paper it is written on, and you know it. You have been keeping this girl like a prisoner, starving her, locking her in the cellar. From what I hear, your husband has been doing worse than that." Mr. Hartwell took a step forward. "Those are lies. Vicious lies from a girl with no morals and no gratitude. We took her in when no one else would have her." "Took her in and broke her down," Callum said flatly. "I have been in Portland 3 days, and in that time, I have heard 5 different people mention that the Hartwells keep their maid locked in the cellar. When enough people whisper about something, it stops being a lie and starts being common knowledge. So here is what is going to happen. I am taking Maeve out of here. If you try to stop me, I will break both your arms. If you go to the sheriff, I will tell him everything I have heard and everything I have seen, and we will let the town decide whether they want to keep doing business with people who torture their help. Do you understand me? The room was absolutely silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Mr. Hartwell's face was turning red, but he did not move. Mrs. Hartwell opened her mouth, closed it again, and then said in a venomous whisper, "She is nothing. Nobody will care what happens to her." "I care," Callum said, "and that is enough." He guided Maeve toward the door. She was shaking so hard she could barely walk, but his arm stayed steady around her waist, holding her up. They passed through the kitchen and into the front hallway. Maeve caught a glimpse of herself in the hall mirror. A pale, thin girl with tangled dark hair and eyes too big for her face. She looked like a ghost. She looked like someone who had given up, but she was walking toward the door. She was leaving. The front door opened, and the evening air rushed in, cool and clean. Maeve took a breath and felt something break open in her chest. She had not realized how trapped she had felt until this moment, when freedom was suddenly, impossibly real. Callum walked her down the front steps and across the yard to where a huge horse stood waiting, its reins tied to the fence. The horse was a bay gelding, solid and calm, with the patient look of an animal that had carried its rider through hard country. "This is Banner," Callum said. "He is a good horse. He will not spook." "Can you ride?" "A little," Maeve said. "I used to when I was small." "That will do." Callum untied the reins and then, with an easy strength that took her breath away, he lifted her up onto the saddle like she weighed nothing at all. She grabbed the saddle horn to steady herself, and a moment later he swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, and suddenly she was surrounded by him, by his warmth and his size and the steady thump of his heartbeat against her back. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. "I promise you that." He urged Banner into a walk, and they moved down the street and away from the Hartwell house. Maeve did not look back. She could not. If she looked back, she might lose her nerve. She might remember all the reasons she had stayed for so long. All the fear and the practicality and the crushing weight of having no choices. Instead, she looked ahead, at the darkening sky and the first stars beginning to appear, and she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change. They rode through Portland as the lamps were being lit, and the evening crowds thinned out. People glanced at them as they passed, but no one stopped them or asked questions. Callum guided Banner with easy confidence, turning down side streets and alleys until they reached a small boarding house on the edge of the residential district. "This is where I have been staying," he said as he dismounted. He reached up and lifted Maeve down, his hands firm on her waist. "The woman who runs it is named Mrs. Chen. She is from China, came here during the gold rush and stayed on. She is a good woman. She will not ask questions and she will not turn you away." Maeve nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion was crashing over her in waves. She swayed on her feet and Callum caught her elbow. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he asked. "I do not remember," she admitted. He made a sound low in his throat that might have been anger or disgust. "Come on, let us get you inside." Mrs. Chen turned out to be a tiny woman with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She took one look at Maeve and immediately began speaking rapid Cantonese while gesturing for them to come in. Callum answered her in the same language, which surprised Maeve so much she nearly tripped on the threshold. Mrs. Chen led them to a small room at the back of the house and said something else to Callum. He nodded and turned to Maeve. "She is going to bring you some food and some hot water for washing," he said. "This room is yours for as long as you need it. Do not worry about the cost. I have it covered." "Why are you doing this?" Maeve asked. The question had been building in her since the moment he had opened the cellar door. "You do not know me. Why would you help me?" Callum was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like old pain. 5 years ago, my sister was in a situation not unlike yours. She was working for a family in Sacramento, and they treated her worse than they treated their dogs. By the time I found out and got there, she had already... He stopped, his jaw working. She had already given up. She took her own life rather than endure another day of it. I was too late to save her, but I am not too late to save you. Maeve's throat tightened with tears. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "So am I," he said. "Every day, but maybe helping you will make some small part of it right. Maybe it will mean she did not suffer for nothing." He turned toward the door, but Maeve reached out and caught his hand before he could leave. His skin was warm under her fingers, rough with calluses and the evidence of hard living. "Thank you," she said. "I do not have the words to tell you what this means, but thank you." Callum looked down at their joined hands and something flickered across his face, too quick for her to read. Then he nodded once. "Get some rest, Maeve. You are safe now. I give you my word on that." He left, and a few minutes later, Mrs. Chen returned with a tray of food, rice and vegetables and tender pieces of chicken in a savory sauce that made Maeve's mouth water. There was also a pot of tea and a basin of hot water with a cloth for washing. Mrs. Chen patted Maeve's hand and said something in a soothing tone before leaving her alone. Maeve ate until her stomach ached, and then she washed the grime and fear off her skin as best she could. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto a small garden. After 2 years of sleeping in the Hartwell's drafty attic, it felt like a palace. She lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment, and fell instantly into the deepest sleep she had had in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then memory returned. The cellar door opening, Callum's hand reaching for hers, the ride through Portland, the safety of this small room. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the tension of the previous day, and looked around. Someone had left a clean dress folded on the chair, along with undergarments and a pair of worn but serviceable boots. There was a soft knock on the door. "Maeve, are you awake?" Callum's voice muffled through the wood. "Yes," she called. "Just a moment." She dressed quickly, grateful for the clean clothes even though the dress was a bit large. When she opened the door, Callum was standing in the hallway, looking slightly uncomfortable in the confines of the indoor space. He seemed like the kind of man who was meant to be outside under open sky. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Thank you for the clothes." "They belong to Mrs. Chen's daughter," he said. "She moved to San Francisco a few years back, but Mrs. Chen kept some of her things. She thought you might have need of them." He paused, then added, "I have been thinking about what comes next for you. Have you got any family? Anyone who could take you in?" Maeve shook her head. "No one. My parents are dead, and I do not have any siblings. There was an aunt in Boston, but she passed away last year. Friends. The other girls I knew when I was younger have all married or moved away. I have been with the Hartwells for 2 years, and they did not allow me much time for socializing." She tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice and mostly failed. Callum nodded slowly. "Then here is what I am thinking. I have a place up in the mountains about 2 days' ride from here. It is remote, but it is mine free and clear. I have got a cabin, some land, a good water source. I go into town every few months for supplies, but mostly I keep to myself. I'm thinking you could come with me, at least until you figure out what you want to do next. I could use help with the day-to-day work, and you would have a safe place to stay. No one would bother you up there." Maeve stared at him. "You are offering me a job. I am offering you a place to breathe and heal and figure out your life without someone standing over you with a whip," he said. "If you want to call that a job, fine. I will pay you fair wages. But mostly I am offering you time and space to be your own person again. It was too much, too generous, too good to be true." "Why?" she asked again. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Callum met her eyes, and there was something raw in his expression. "Because nobody did it for my sister. Because I have been alone in those mountains for 3 years. And maybe it is time I remembered that human beings are supposed to help each other. Because when I saw you in that cellar, I saw every person who has ever been powerless and afraid, and I decided right then that I was not going to walk away. Does that answer your question?" "Yes," Maeve whispered. Her eyes were burning with unshed tears. "Yes, it does. And yes, I will go with you. I would be grateful for it." Something in Callum's expression eased. He nodded. "Good. We will leave tomorrow morning. That will give you today to rest and get your strength back. Mrs. Chen is making lunch, and she has insisted you eat at least 3 meals before we go. She thinks you are too thin." Maeve laughed, and it felt strange, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. She is probably right. They spent the rest of that day in quiet preparation. Callum went out to purchase supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, and a few other staples. He also bought Maeve a sturdy coat, because the mountains would be cold even in late spring. Mrs. Chen fussed over Maeve, feeding her until she could barely move and teaching her a few words of Cantonese. It was the most peaceful day Maeve could remember having in years. That evening, as the sun was setting, Maeve found Callum in the boarding house's small yard, checking Banner's hooves and gear. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Callum," she said, "can I ask you something?" He looked up. "Sure. What made you come looking for me?" "I mean, I know people were talking, but lots of people talk about bad things and never do anything about them. What made you decide to act?" Callum straightened up, resting one hand on Banner's neck. "I was in a saloon," he said. 2 men were talking. One of them was saying how the Hartwells kept a maid locked up like a dog, and the other one laughed and said you probably deserved it. Said girls like you were too stupid to know when they had it good, and I just... He shook his head. I could not let that stand. I could not sit there and do nothing while another girl suffered the way my sister did. So I asked around, found out where the Hartwells lived, and went over there. I told them I was a friend of your family's and I had come to check on you. They tried to turn me away, but I am not easy to turn away when I set my mind to something." "No," Maeve said softly. "I do not imagine you are." "I was ready to tear that house apart if I had to," Callum continued, "but Mrs. Hartwell panicked when I started asking about the cellar, and that told me everything I needed to know. The rest you saw. You could have gotten in trouble," Maeve said. "They could have called the sheriff. You could have been arrested." "Maybe," Callum allowed. "But I have been in trouble before. I can handle it." "What did you do before you became a mountain man?" she asked. "You said you lived in Sacramento. Were you always a trapper?" "No, I was a soldier for a while during the war. Then I worked on the railroad when they were pushing through the mountains. After my sister died, I just wanted to get away from people. I had saved up some money, so I bought a piece of land and built a cabin and taught myself to hunt and trap. It has been a quiet life, but a good one." Maeve tried to imagine what that life must be like. The solitude, the silence, the endless stretch of wild country. It sounded both terrifying and wonderful. "Are you not lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But lonely is better than surrounded by people who make you miserable. At least, That is what I have told myself for the past 3 years. And now you are bringing me into your solitude, Maeve said. Does that bother you? Callum looked at her for a long moment. The setting sun cast gold light across his face, catching in his eyes and turning them amber. No, he said finally. It does not bother me at all. I think maybe it is time I had some company again. And I think maybe you could use a place where nobody will hurt you. I could, Maeve agreed. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I really could. They stood there in the fading light, not quite looking at each other, both of them aware that something was shifting between them, some unspoken understanding taking shape. Maeve did not know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. They set out the next morning just after dawn. Mrs. Chen packed them enough food for several days and hugged Maeve so tightly she could barely breathe. Callum helped Maeve up onto Banner's back and then swung up behind her, just as he had the night they left the Hartwells. This time, though, Maeve was not shaking with fear. This time, she was riding towards something instead of running away. They left Portland behind and headed into the wilderness. The road quickly gave way to a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills of the Cascade Range. The forest closed in around them, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, their branches creating a green canopy overhead. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the clean, sharp scent of mountain water. Callum talked as they rode, pointing out landmarks and explaining the country. He showed her how to read the forest, how to tell which plants were edible and which would make you sick, how to find water and shelter. Maeve listened carefully, storing away every piece of information. She had never been taught these things. She had spent her whole life in towns and cities, dependent on others for her survival. But she was a quick learner, and she was determined to become more than just a burden. They stopped at midday to rest Banner and eat some of the food Mrs. Chen had packed. Callum built a small fire and made coffee, strong and bitter the way frontier people drank it. Maeve wrapped her hands around the tin cup and sipped carefully, letting the warmth spread through her. "How much farther?" she asked. "We will camp tonight somewhere along the trail," Callum said. "Then it is another day's ride to the cabin. The terrain gets rougher the higher we go." "I have never slept outside before," Maeve admitted. "Nothing to it," Callum said. "I have got blankets and a good canvas tarp. We will stay dry and warm, and I will keep watch. You do not have to worry about animals or anything else." That night, they made camp in a small clearing beside a stream. Callum set up a simple shelter using the tarp and some rope, creating a lean-to that would keep the dew off them. He built a fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork, and they ate in comfortable silence. When darkness fell, the stars came out in a brilliant display that took Maeve's breath away. She had never seen so many stars. In Portland, the lamps and smoke obscured them, but here they filled the sky from horizon to horizon. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It is," Callum agreed. He was sitting on the other side of the fire, his face half in shadow. "When I first came up here, I spent hours every night just looking at the stars. Made me feel small, but in a good way. Like my problems were not as big as I thought they were." "Did it help?" Maeve asked. "After your sister?" "Some," he said. "Not as much as I hoped, but it gave me space to grieve without people telling me I should move on or get over it. Out here, you can feel whatever you need to feel, and the mountains do not judge you for it." Maeve pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I am glad you brought me here," she said. "Whatever happens next, I am glad I am not in that cellar anymore." "You are never going back there," Callum said, and there was steel in his voice. "I swear that to you, Maeve. Whatever it takes, you are never going back to that kind of life." She believed him. Against all reason and all her years of learning not to trust anyone, she believed him completely. They reached Callum's cabin late the next afternoon. It sat in a high mountain valley, surrounded by towering pines and with a view of snow-capped peaks in the distance. The cabin itself was small but solidly built, constructed from hand-hewn logs and chinked with moss and mud. There was a stone chimney, a small covered porch, and a lean-to stable for Banner. Behind the cabin, Maeve could see a garden plot that had been turned over for spring planting. "It is not much," Callum said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it is home." "It is wonderful," Maeve said, and she meant it. The cabin looked like safety. It looked like peace. Inside, the space was divided into 2 rooms. A main living area with a fireplace, a table, some chairs and a shelf of supplies, and a smaller back room that Callum used for storage and sleeping. Everything was neat and well maintained, which surprised her until she remembered that Callum had been a soldier. Soldiers learned discipline and order, and those habits stayed with you. "You can take the bedroom," Callum said. "I will sleep out here by the fire. It is no hardship." "I have done it before." "I cannot take your bed," Maeve protested. "Yes, you can and you will," Callum said firmly. "You need proper rest and privacy. I will be fine out here. Do not argue with me, Maeve. You will not win." She smiled despite herself. "You are very stubborn." "So I have been told." He started unpacking their supplies, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who had lived alone for a long time. "Tomorrow, I will show you around the property. There is a stream about 100 yards south where we get water. I have got some traps set up in the woods for rabbits and squirrels, and if you are interested, I could teach you to shoot. Might be useful for you to know how to handle a rifle." "I would like that," Maeve said. The idea of being able to defend herself, of not being helpless, appealed to her more than she could say. Over the next few weeks, Maeve settled into a new rhythm of life. She learned to cook over an open fire, to tend the garden, to mend clothes and preserve food. Callum taught her to shoot, starting with a small pistol and working up to the rifle. She had a good eye and steady hands, and after a few days of practice, she could hit a target more often than not. She also learned to read the mountains the way Callum did. He taught her which animal tracks belonged to deer and which to mountain lions. He showed her where to find wild berries and edible roots, how to identify poisonous plants and avoid them. They checked his trap lines together, and he taught her how to skin and prepare small game. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and for the first time in her life, Maeve felt like she was learning skills that truly mattered. More than that, she felt herself healing. The constant fear that had lived in her chest for 2 years began to ease. She slept through the night without nightmares. She started to smile more, to laugh at Callum's dry humor, to feel like a person again instead of just a thing that people used and discarded. And slowly, carefully, she started to notice Callum in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. She noticed the way his muscles flexed when he chopped wood, the powerful swing of the axe and the easy strength in his arms and back. She noticed how gentle his hands could be when he was handling something delicate, despite the calluses and scars. She noticed the way his hair caught the light when he pushed it back from his face, and the rare, breathtaking smile that transformed his stern features into something warm and open. She noticed, and she tried very hard not to let herself hope for something that could never happen. She was here out of charity, out of Callum's goodness and his grief for his sister. He had saved her because it was the right thing to do, not because he had any romantic interest in her. She needed to remember that. She needed to be grateful for what she had and not reach for more. But then, about a month after they had arrived at the cabin, something changed. They had gone down to the stream to refill their water barrels, and Maeve had slipped on a wet rock. Callum caught her before she fell, his arms snapping around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. For a moment they stood frozen like that, her back pressed to his front, his arm banded around her middle. Maeve could feel the heat of him through her dress, could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Careful," he said, and his voice was rough. "The rocks are slippery here." "Thank you," she managed. Her heart was racing, and she knew it had nothing to do with nearly falling. Callum released her slowly, almost reluctantly, and when she turned to look at him, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. He looked at her like she was something precious, something he wanted to protect and cherish. He looked at her the way a man looked at a woman he cared for. "Maeve," he started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with something. "I should not. It is not right for me to." "What?" she asked softly. "What is not right?" "This," he said roughly. "The way I have been thinking about you. You came here to be safe, not to have another man putting expectations on you. I do not want you to feel like you owe me anything. I do not want you to think that I helped you because I wanted something in return." Maeve's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "What if I wanted you to think about me?" she asked. "What if I have been thinking about you too?" Callum went very still. "Have you?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said. The word came out firm and clear, and she felt powerful saying it. This was her choice, her decision. "Yes, I have. Every day I look at you and I think about how kind you are, how strong, how patient. I think about the way you saved me without asking for anything in return. I think about what it would be like if you kissed me, and I do not feel afraid. I feel hopeful." For a long moment, Callum just stared at her. Then he said, "You are 19 years old. I am 31. You have been through hell, and you have not had enough time to figure out who you are without someone controlling you. I do not want to be another person who takes advantage of you." "You would not be," Maeve said fiercely. She stepped closer to him, close enough to lay her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Callum, you gave me my life back. You gave me choices again, and I am choosing this. I am choosing you if you want me. If I want you," Callum let out a shaky breath. "Maeve, I have wanted you since the moment I saw you in that cellar, and you looked up at me like I was your last hope. I have wanted you every day since, and I have been trying so damn hard not to let it show because I did not want to scare you or pressure you. But if you are telling me that you feel the same way, then I am done holding back." He cupped her face in his big, scarred hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he said. "Anytime, for any reason, you just say the word and I stop. Do you understand?" "I understand," Maeve said. "But I do not want you to stop. I want you to kiss me. Please." He kissed her. It was nothing like the fumbling, unwanted groping Mr. Hartwell had subjected her to. This was soft and careful and full of restrained passion. Callum kissed her like she was something rare and breakable, like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. His lips moved over hers with a gentleness that made her want to cry. And when she sighed and leaned into him, his arms came around her, strong and protective and utterly safe. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Callum rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I am in love with you," he said quietly. "I did not mean for it to happen, but it did. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever met, and I am in love with you." Maeve felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I am in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could ever feel this way about anyone, but I do. I love you, Callum Quinn." He kissed her again, and this time there was less restraint, more passion. His hands moved to her waist, holding her close, and she wound her arms around his neck, marveling at how solid and real he was. This was not a dream. This was her life, her choice, her future unfolding in the best possible way. When they finally made their way back to the cabin, hand in hand, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Maeve felt like she was walking on air. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation, and yet nothing felt rushed or wrong. It felt inevitable, like this was where they had been heading all along. That night, they sat by the fire and talked for hours. Callum told her about his childhood in Missouri, his decision to join the army, the horrors of the war and the friendships he had made. He told her about his sister, whose name had been Catherine, and how she had been the only family he had left after their parents died. He told her about the guilt he still carried, the feeling that if he had just been there sooner, he could have saved her. Maeve held his hand and told him that it was not his fault, that he could not have known what was happening, that he had honored his sister's memory by saving Maeve. She told him about her own childhood in Boston, the fever that killed her parents, the years of being passed from household to household like an unwanted burden. She told him about the Hartwells, about the cellar and the fear and the slow erosion of her sense of self. She told him things she had never spoken aloud, and he listened without judgment, his hand steady in hers. By the time they went to bed, Maeve felt lighter than she had in years. She lay in Callum's bed, alone for now because they had agreed to take things slowly, but knowing he was just on the other side of the door if she needed him. She fell asleep with a smile on her face and dreamed of a future that looked bright and full of possibility. The summer passed in a golden haze. Maeve and Callum worked the land together, tending the garden, hunting for meat, preserving food for the coming winter. They grew closer with every passing day, learning each other's rhythms and quirks and preferences. Maeve learned that Callum was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee in his hand. Callum learned that Maeve hummed when she was concentrating, and that she had a wicked sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. They kissed often, long, slow kisses that left them both breathless and wanting more. But Callum was careful, always careful to let Maeve set the pace. He never pushed, never demanded. He made it clear that he wanted her, but that he would wait until she was ready. One night in late July, as they lay together on a blanket outside watching the stars, Maeve turned to him and said, "I am ready." Callum looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said. "I want to be with you, Callum, completely. I want us to belong to each other." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and she felt the restraint he had been holding on to for weeks finally begin to slip. They made love under the stars, and it was everything Maeve had hoped it would be, tender and passionate and full of love. Callum was gentle with her, mindful of her inexperience, and he made sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. Afterward, he held her close, his hand stroking her hair, and whispered that he loved her over and over until she fell asleep in his arms. When August came, Callum rode down to Portland to sell some furs and pick up supplies. He was gone for 3 days, and Maeve found that she missed him terribly. The cabin felt empty without his presence, and she spent the time counting down the hours until he returned. When he finally rode up the trail, she ran out to meet him, and he swept her up in his arms and kissed her right there in front of Banner and the whole empty wilderness. "I have something for you," he said when he set her down. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Open it." Maeve unwrapped the paper carefully and found a simple gold ring inside. It was not fancy or expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and when she looked up at Callum, he was watching her with an expression that made her heart turn over. "Maeve Nolan," he said, "I know we have not known each other for very long by conventional standards. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains. So I am asking you, will you marry me?" "Yes," Maeve said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Callum, I will marry you. I will absolutely marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her and she kissed him back, and they stood there in the fading summer light, holding each other and dreaming about the future they would build together. They were married in September, in a small ceremony in Portland with Mrs. Chen and the local preacher as witnesses. Maeve wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Callum wore his best clothes, his hair neatly tied back. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Callum kissed her with such tenderness that Maeve felt her heart might burst from happiness. They spent their wedding night at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, in the same small room where Maeve had first stayed. Mrs. Chen had decorated it with wildflowers and left a bottle of wine on the table. Callum made love to his wife slowly and thoroughly, worshipping her body with his hands and mouth, until she was trembling and crying out his name. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Maeve thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. They returned to the cabin the next day, and Maeve realized with a sense of deep contentment that she was going home. The cabin in the mountains was home now. Callum was home. The seasons turned. Autumn came, painting the mountains in shades of red and gold. Maeve and Callum worked hard to prepare for winter, canning vegetables, smoking meat, and stacking firewood. They also made improvements to the cabin, adding a second room so they would have more space. Callum built Maeve a proper kitchen table and some shelves for her things, and she made curtains for the windows and a quilt for their bed. When the first snow fell, they were ready. The cabin was warm and well stocked, and they had plenty of wood to last through even the harshest weather. They spent the long winter nights by the fire, reading aloud from the few books Callum owned, playing cards and making love in the warmth of their bed. It was a quiet life, but it was a good one, and Maeve had never been happier. In the spring, Maeve realized she was pregnant. She told Callum one morning over breakfast, and he stared at her for a long moment before a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "A baby," he said. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Maeve confirmed. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Callum came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "Maeve, I am the happiest man alive. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a wife, and now a child. I do not deserve you, but I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Maeve said softly. "You already are, Callum." The pregnancy was not easy. Maeve was sick for the first few months, and Callum was so worried that he barely left her side. But gradually, she began to feel better, and by summer, her belly was round and full, and the baby was kicking strongly. Callum would often rest his hand on her stomach in the evenings, marveling at the feel of his child moving under his palm. "What do you hope for?" Maeve asked him one night. "A boy or a girl, I do not care," Callum said honestly. "As long as the baby is healthy and you are healthy, I will be happy. But if I had to choose, I think I would like a daughter. A little girl with your dark hair and your stubborn spirit, and your eyes," Maeve said. "Those blue eyes of yours are impossible to resist," Callum grinned. "If we have a girl, she's going to have every boy in Oregon wrapped around her little finger." "Good," Maeve said. "Let her know her own power. Let her grow up strong and unafraid." "She will," Callum promised. "With you as her mother, how could she be anything else?" The baby came on a cold November morning, a week earlier than Maeve had expected. Callum had ridden down to Portland the day before to fetch a midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Sanders who had delivered half the babies in the county. She arrived at the cabin just as Maeve's pains were growing stronger, and she took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. The labor was long and painful, but Maeve was strong, and she had Callum by her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally came, wailing and red-faced, Mrs. Sanders wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed the bundle in Maeve's arms. "It is a boy," she said with a smile. "A big, healthy boy. Congratulations." Maeve looked down at her son, at his tiny face and dark fuzz of hair, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Callum leaned over her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, there were tears running down his face. "He is perfect," Callum whispered. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Maeve. Thank you for him. Thank you for everything." They named him Connor Quinn, and he was the light of their lives. Callum was a devoted father, always patient and gentle with his son. He would carry Connor around the cabin in the crook of his arm, talking to him about the mountains and the animals and the stars. Maeve would watch them together and feel such a profound sense of contentment that she sometimes had to stop and remind herself that this was real, that this was her life. Connor grew quickly, turning from a tiny infant into a chubby, laughing baby. He had Callum's blue eyes and Maeve's dark hair, and he had inherited his father's even temperament. He rarely cried, and he seemed fascinated by everything around him, reaching for snowflakes and firelight with equal curiosity. When Connor was 6 months old, Maeve discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and 9 months later, on a warm summer evening, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Catherine, after Callum's sister, and Callum held his tiny daughter and cried like his heart was breaking and healing all at once. "Catherine would have loved her," Maeve said softly as she watched Callum rock his daughter. "She would have been so proud of you, Callum, of the man you have become, of the family you have built." "I hope so," Callum said. His voice was thick with emotion. "I hope she knows that I think of her every day, that I tried to honor her memory by being better, by doing better." "She knows," Maeve said. "I am sure of it." The years passed, and the Quinn family grew and thrived. Connor and Catherine were joined by 2 more children. A son they named Daniel and another daughter they named Sarah. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Callum built a larger house on the same piece of land, a sturdy 2-story structure with plenty of room for everyone. The children grew up wild and free in the mountains, learning to hunt and fish and track animals. Callum taught them to shoot and to respect the wilderness. Maeve taught them to read and write and think for themselves. They were a close family, bound together by love and mutual respect. Connor grew into a strong, serious boy who was already showing signs of his father's quiet strength. Catherine was bright and fearless, with a quick laugh and an adventurous spirit. Daniel was the gentle one, always rescuing injured animals and nursing them back to health. And Sarah, the baby, was a charmer who could talk her way out of any trouble. Maeve often thought back to that day in the cellar, when Callum had opened the door and carried her into the light. It felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. She was no longer that frightened, broken girl. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who knew her own worth and her own power. One evening, when the children were all asleep and Callum and Maeve were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Maeve reached over and took his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking me in, changing your quiet life for all this chaos?" Callum turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was so clear and strong that it took her breath away. "Not for one single second," he said. "You gave me a reason to live again, Maeve. You gave me a family and a purpose. You gave me everything. If I could go back and do it all over again, I would not change a thing." "Neither would I," Maeve said. She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. As the years continued to pass, the Quinn family became a fixture in the small community of mountain settlers. Callum was known as a fair man, strong and reliable, someone you could count on in a crisis. Maeve became the person people turned to when they needed advice or help. She delivered babies, tended the sick, and taught the children of neighboring families to read and write. Connor grew into a young man, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with the same quiet confidence and steady demeanor. At 20, he married a girl from town named Emma, and they built their own cabin not far from the main house. Catherine, at 18, was courted by half a dozen young men, but she insisted she was not ready to settle down yet. She wanted to see more of the world first, she said, and Callum and Maeve supported her decision, knowing that their daughter was more than capable of taking care of herself. Daniel, at 16, was apprenticing with a veterinarian in Portland, learning how to care for animals more systematically. And Sarah, at 14, was already showing signs of becoming a skilled horsewoman and tracker. Callum and Maeve grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces lining with age, but the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. They had built something rare and precious, a true partnership based on respect and affection and shared values. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Callum took Maeve back to the spot where he had first kissed her, by the stream where she had slipped on the wet rocks. The place looked much the same, though they had worn a path to it over the years, coming here whenever they needed a quiet moment away from the bustle of family life. "I have been thinking about the day I found you," Callum said as they stood by the water. "About how different our lives could have been if I had just walked away, if I had decided it was not my problem." "But you did not walk away," Maeve said. "You never walk away when someone needs help. It is one of the things I love most about you." "I am glad I did not," Callum said, "because you have given me the best 25 years of my life. You took a broken, angry man and showed him that there was still beauty and goodness in the world. You gave me a family and a home. You gave me love. And I want you to know that I am grateful for every single day I have spent with you." Maeve felt tears prick her eyes. Even after all these years, he could still make her cry with his words. "I am grateful too," she said. "You saved my life, Callum, not just that day in the cellar, but every day since. You showed me what it meant to be loved unconditionally. You gave me the courage to become who I was meant to be. And I will love you until the day I die, and probably long after that." He kissed her then, and it was just as sweet as the first time, just as full of promise and possibility. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Maeve thought about everything they had been through together, all the challenges and joys and sorrows. They had buried parents and friends over the years. They had weathered harsh winters and dry summers. They had raised 4 children into good, strong adults, and through it all they had loved each other fiercely and without reservation. That night, as they lay in bed together, Callum pulled Maeve close and whispered, "I would do it all again. Every single moment, every hardship, every joy. Because it all led me to you, and you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Maeve kissed him, long and deep, and then she whispered back, "You are my miracle, Callum Quinn, my rescuer, my love. And I will thank God every day for the rest of my life that you were brave enough to open that cellar door and carry me into the light." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, 2 souls who had found each other in the darkness and had built a life together in the light. And if anyone had asked them whether they believed in fate or destiny, they would have said yes, absolutely yes, because some things were simply meant to be. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Quinn family continued to grow and flourish. Connor and Emma had 3 children of their own, and Catherine eventually did settle down with a surveyor named James who shared her love of adventure. Daniel opened his own veterinary practice in Portland, but came home to the mountains every chance he got. And Sarah married a rancher from Montana and moved north, though she wrote faithfully every week and visited every summer. Callum and Maeve became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree branch out in all directions. They grew old together, their bodies slowing down but their spirits still strong. They spent their days sitting on the porch, watching the mountains and remembering all the years they had shared. When Callum finally passed away, at the age of 82, Maeve was holding his hand. His last words to her were, "I love you, always have, always will." Maeve lived for 3 more years after Callum's death, spending her time surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the day he had rescued her from the cellar, about the life they had built together in the mountains. She wanted them to understand that love was a choice, a daily decision to put someone else's happiness alongside your own. She wanted them to know that kindness mattered, that standing up for someone who could not stand up for themselves was worth any risk. When Maeve died, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76, her family buried her next to Callum on the hillside overlooking their valley. They placed a simple stone marker that read, "Maeve Quinn, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She was lost in the darkness, but love brought her into the light." And in the years that followed, the Quinn descendants would bring their own children to that hillside and tell them the story of how their great-great-grandmother had been locked in a cellar, and how their great-great-grandfather had broken down the door and carried her into the sunlight. They told the story as a reminder that one act of courage could change everything, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the best things in life came from simply choosing to help another human being. The cabin that Callum built still stood, maintained by the family as a reminder of where it all began. And on warm summer evenings, if you listened carefully, you might almost hear the echo of laughter, the sound of children playing, and the quiet murmur of 2 people who had loved each other across a lifetime, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the mountains they had made their home. That was the legacy of Callum and Maeve Quinn, a legacy of love, courage, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and kindness. It was a legacy that would live on long after they were gone, carried forward by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who bore their names and their values. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Callum and Maeve were together again, walking hand in hand through eternal mountains under endless stars, their love as strong and true as it had been on that first day when he had looked down into a dark cellar and seen a frightened girl looking back up at him with hope in her eyes. He had saved her life. She had saved his soul. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to reach out a hand to someone who is drowning. The story of Callum and Maeve Quinn became the stuff of family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires for generations. It became a story about hope in dark places, about the courage to act when action is needed, and about the way 2 broken people can heal each other if they are brave enough to let love in. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply see another person suffering and decide to do something about it. Because you never know when one moment of kindness might change the course of 2 lives forever, creating ripples that spread out through time and touch people you will never meet. Callum Quinn had walked into that house looking for a girl in need. He had walked out with his future wife, his soulmate, the mother of his children. And if you had asked him whether he believed in miracles, he would have pointed to Maeve and said, "She is my miracle, and I am hers." That was the truth of it, simple and profound. Two people, brought together by chance and circumstance, who chose to love each other and build a life together against all odds. Two people who proved that it is never too late to start over, never too late to find happiness, never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. The mountains remembered them. The valley remembered them. And most importantly, their family remembered them, keeping their story alive as a reminder of what really matters in this life. Not wealth or status or power, but love, kindness, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard. Years turned into decades and decades into centuries, but the story remained. Because some stories are too important to forget, too powerful to let fade away. The story of how Callum Quinn opened a cellar door and found his destiny in the darkness. The story of how Maeve Nolan walked into the sunlight and into a new life. The story of how two people saved each other and created a love that would echo through generations. And if you ever find yourself in the mountains of Oregon, in a certain valley where the pines grow tall and the streams run clear, you might come across an old homestead with a well-maintained cabin and a cemetery on the hillside. If you stop to read the markers there, you will find the graves of Callum and Maeve Quinn, side by side as they were in life, together forever in death. And if you close your eyes and listen to the wind in the trees, you might hear the faint echo of their voices, still talking, still laughing, still loving each other across time and distance and all the barriers that separate the living from the dead. Because love like theirs does not end. It transforms, becomes something greater than itself, becomes a legacy and a promise and a beacon of hope for everyone who comes after. That is the gift that Callum and Maeve gave to the world. The knowledge that love is real, that courage matters, that kindness can change lives, and that sometimes the person you save ends up being the person who saves you right back. And so the story ends where it began, with a door opening, with light flooding into darkness, with a strong hand reaching down and a frightened hand reaching up, and two souls connecting in a moment that would define the rest of their lives. It ends with love triumphant, with family thriving, with a legacy that will never be forgotten. It ends, as all the best stories do, with hope.